somewhere along the line there's going to be some good news, but I'm not sure where. I'm going to talk about the effect of air pollution on the brain. As I frequently tell audiences, air pollution affects virtually every single organ system, and it affects even your favorite organs. And my favorite organs are my brain, my heart, and my lungs. And if I were to ask any guy in this audience what his favorite organs are, I'm afraid what you'd tell me. But they're supposed to be your brain, your heart, and your lungs. Those are supposed to be your three favorite organs. Well, they're at risk also. You've seen this sort of a picture. This is your brain on drugs. Well, this is your brain on air pollution. And if that's disconcerting to you, let me tell you why that's the case. Air pollution not only affects the brain by the normal delivery system of being inhaled through the lungs and then delivered to the arterial system, which then permeates every single organ you have, but air pollution also has an accessory pathway to inflame brain tissue, and that is directly through the nose. The particulate matter that has been mentioned multiple times can attach itself to the mucosa, the lining of the nose, which then attaches to the nerves in the nose, and then this particulate matter migrates slowly directly to the brainstem, causing brain inflammation. So your brain gets a double dose of pollution through your lungs and actually directly through your nose, bypassing your lungs. Air pollution components, therefore, can penetrate deeply into the brain tissue, all the way into the brain stem. Furthermore, many of the compounds adsorbed to particulate matter are neurotoxic. It isn't just that this particulate matter are little tiny specks. A lot of these little tiny particles also have heavy metals attached to them. So when you inhale them and they get into your nose, you are inhaling little teeny specks of heavy metals. Heavy metals, as a group, are very neurotoxic. We all know and are familiar with the fact that the CDC has said probably in the last 5 years there is no safe level of exposure to lead. Well, the same could be true of a lot of the heavy metals. So whenever there's particulate matter in the air, you're not just getting little tiny particles of carbon. You're also getting little tiny particles of intensely neurotoxic heavy metals. Well, that has some real consequence. Multiple kinds of studies on humans and animals show long-term exposure to air pollution can lead to learning and memory problems and even depression. A number of researchers dealing with mice in Los Angeles, in Brazil, in Sao Paulo, where the air pollution is frequently worse, if not almost always a little worse than ours. Animals that are bred in this circumstance with outside of filtered air circumstances show microscopically the kinds of early changes of Alzheimer's and Parkinson's compared to animals that breathe filtered air. Furthermore, animals show in utero exposure, or when they're exposed in utero to low concentrations of diesel exhaust, will demonstrate decreased fetal activity in pregnant animals, and it's usually within about an hour. That's all it takes before this inflammatory process that affects all these organs starts to kick in. Tiny doses of carbon monoxide can damage fetal brains. Prenatal exposure is more damaging than postnatal exposure. In other words, the younger in the developmental process you are exposed to pollution, the more damage occurs. And this is associated with reductions in the production of proteins that are critical to the function of the cerebellum. Now, if you were to think of the nerve cells in your brain as little tiny branches of trees, they have all these little extensions, and then they have flowers on the end of them. Microscopic examination of animals exposed to more air pollution show that there are less branches, less blossoms, less opportunities for neurons to connect with one another. It doesn't take a real vivid imagination to think that if you have less branching of your neurons and less dendrites and less overall complexity, that's going to affect your intelligence. And in fact, it absolutely does. Microscopic evidence of brain inflammation amongst people who are exposed to more air pollution shows the same kinds of protein depositions that we see microscopically in patients who have Alzheimer's and other forms of senility. This was a remarkable study done by researchers using children and dogs in Mexico City, where the air pollution averages about twice what we experience. These researchers did neurologic testing on children who grew up in Mexico City, compared them to a control group who grew up with less pollution, and they found that controlling for everything else, the children that grew up with more air pollution had lower intelligence. Then they did MRI scans on them, and this is an example of one of them, and they found that 60% of children, again, this is children, showed hyperintense white matter prefrontal lesions where that arrow is pointing, which are indicative of reduced blood flow and are frequently thought of as the precursors to neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's and Parkinsonism. The control group showed only 8% of these kinds of lesions, again, amongst children and young adults. Air pollution causes inflammation and oxidative stress and DNA damage in brain cells directly, ultimately leaving us with the chemical markers, the histologic markers, and the MRI proof that it's affecting children's intelligence. Studies of diesel exhaust show that if you hook up EEGs to people who are exposed to diesel exhaust, you can see right away an increase in cortical inflammation. This was a remarkable study done and published a couple of years ago by the Harvard School of Public Health, where they took a group of children throughout Boston, and then they divided them into various groups depending on how much air pollution they were exposed to. And they found that if you control for all the other variables, like socioeconomic status, smoking in the home, and so forth, the children who grew up with more air pollution had an IQ loss by comparison to the children who grew up with less of 9 points. That is an absolute career changer. 9 points difference just based on the amount of air pollution that they breathe. And if this were the only study that suggested this was a serious problem, it'd be one thing. But there are many other studies to support the same sort of conclusions, like this. Researchers from the Columbia School of Public Health have been involved for the last 12 years on trying to understand what air pollution does to fetal development. And what they found is that amongst 5-year-old children born to women who breathe more air pollution, and the cutoff of dividing one group as a more exposed group compared to a less exposed group was 2.26 nanograms of PAHs. Now, PAH stands for polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, and this is the family of compounds that benzene is the mother compound of. So these are benzene-like compounds. They are a ubiquitous part of air pollution because they're part of fossil fuel combustion and refining processes, and we're going to have a lot of that along Refinery Row, but we also have a lot of it wherever we have any sort of vehicle exhaust. The mothers who are exposed to more than 2.26 nanograms of PAHs, their children 5 years later showed IQ losses of about 5 points compared to children whose mothers grew up with less. Now, we don't measure PAHs routinely here in Utah, but I can tell you that this is a very minimal dose of PAHs. Other studies show cognitive and motor development decline or loss in 4-year-old children who are exposed to more traffic-related nitrogen oxide compounds, especially if there is more than 24.7 micrograms per cubic meter. Just for a reference, the Wasatch Front averages about 38 to 57 micrograms per cubic meter. Autism rates are double for families that live close to a freeway. How does air pollution affect the placenta? Well, your eyes perhaps would be the best judge of how it affects the placenta. On the right are animals that were exposed to filtered air, and on the left are animals that were exposed to 27.5 micrograms per cubic meter, and basically unfiltered air, typical of Los Angeles, less than what we're experiencing today. These are microscopic sections of the placenta, and you can see that on the left, your left, my right, the vessels are more congested. And what we see is on the maternal side of the placenta, the vessels are more constricted, and that obviously creates problems for blood flow. If I showed you pictures of the fetal side, those blood vessels are dilated because they're trying to compensate for the restriction of blood flow. So the maternal fetal surface ratio values decline by 20 to 40% based on their air pollution exposure. And this slide may show that even a little bit better. You can see on this side, the blood vessels are basically much wider compared to that side. And to a lesser extent, this same finding was found if the pregnant mice were exposed to air pollution before they got pregnant, but were exposed to filtered air afterwards. In other words, the relevant exposure could have preceded the conception and still had a prominent effect like this. And so, do we see confirmation of problems with fetal outcomes in epidemiologic studies? And we absolutely do. Women that are exposed to more air pollution show higher rates of, during pregnancy, preeclampsia, spontaneous abortion, intrauterine growth retardation, low birth weight syndrome, premature birth, and even smaller head size. Higher rates of birth defects, like heart and neural tube defects. Epigenetics is a term that is really replacing the gene as biology center of the universe, and what that means is there are, I'm oversimplifying a bit, but there are chemical attachments to chromosomes that can steer the chromosomal function in a certain direction. You can have an alteration of chromosomal function by virtue of the chemicals attached to those chromosomes without actually breaking the chromosomes. And it turns out that air pollution does that very thing. It can cause epigenetic changes in chromosomes without breaking them, but the disease consequence can be almost identical. If you think of it this way, if you have a musician with a violin producing some music, the DNA itself, or the genotype, is the violin, epigenetics is the performer, and the end result of how the organism is expressed is the music that you hear. If the musician forgets the notes, or the violin is broken, then they're going to have a compromise of the music. But either one can do it. It doesn't have to be a breaking of the violin. It can be a malfunction or a sudden brain cramp on the part of the musician, and that's how epigenetics works. And the point of that is it takes a lot less exposure to cause epigenetic changes than it does genetic changes, but the outcome on disease consequence can be the same. So again, that same research team from the Columbia School of Public Health found that mothers who are exposed during pregnancy to more air pollution show at the time of birth 50% more chromosomal changes, chromosomal aberrations, more epigenetic or chemical attachments to their chromosomes at the time of birth, and that has profound and lifelong consequence in terms of their propensity for later on chronic adult diseases. This statement by one of their lead researchers, that fetal susceptibility to DNA damage from air pollution has important implications for cancer risk and developmental problems of all types. One of the things that's interesting, in referring back to the issue of heavy metals being attached to particulate matter, heavy metals like nickel, chromium, and arsenic are carcinogens, we know that, because of their epigenetic effect. And every time you breathe particulate matter, you're likely breathing some of those particles that have heavy metals attached to them, and so are the pregnant women. Well, we find more specifically that air pollution causes epigenetic changes in genes that have the function of tumor suppression. You have 20,000 some odd genes in your body, and some of them are tumor suppressors, some of them are tumor promoters. Air pollution can change the function of those genes, and we find that within 3 days, air pollution can start to change the function of tumor suppressor genes. Air pollution can also cause alteration in the functioning of genes, turning them on or off inappropriately with a prolonged and potentially lifelong effect capable of being passed on to subsequent generations. And that's the key. I'll give you a specific example. If a mother during pregnancy breathes air pollution with higher concentrations of polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, again, benzene-type compounds, That changes the gene conformation in the womb, and even if after birth that child is not exposed to more air pollution, there will be higher rates of asthma and loss of lung function because of the genetic changes, the epigenetic changes, excuse me, in the womb that occurred during the pregnancy. So the children who are affected now by asthma, and you saw a very tragic example of it here just a little while ago, the relevant exposure could be the pregnant mother, not even the child. Prenatal air pollution exposure, or excuse me, prenatal air pollution breathed by the mother also alters the immune system of newborns. And when that happens, obviously you're setting a person up for all kinds of diseases, infections, and autoimmune disorders. So another way to put this message is a woman's short-term exposure to low-level pollution can affect literally the health of multiple generations. And the relevant exposure could be one that preceded conception. Now we find that in fact epigenetic exposure, or excuse me, epigenetic changes can occur with so little exposure that it's in the neighborhood of parts per million. And in studies published just in the last couple of months, now we see these kinds of changes don't even require 3 days to occur. They can start occurring within minutes after exposure. And finally, those of you men who still want to reproduce, there's an issue here. Episodic exposure to air pollution is associated with increased DNA fragmentation in human sperm. That means your chance of handing off to your children and grandchildren these kinds of epigenetic changes, we see that they're demonstrable in the sperm that men produce. So, we are what our grandparents inhaled, and our grandchildren will be what we inhale today. So the issue we're talking about today is not just your personal issue, not even just your family's personal issue. It's the personal issue of subsequent generations as well.